TSA. Agent accuses black woman of smuggling, then realizes she's the head of customs. They say you never truly know a person until you've seen them at an airport. The frantic pace, the tension in every queue, and the simmering tempers waiting to boil over a perfect storm for drama. In today's story, a routine day at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport spirals into a shocking confrontation that threatens to destroy a promising TSA agent's career. But beneath the chaos, a powerful twist is waiting to emerge. Little does anyone suspect that the quiet, dignified black woman singled out for inspection is no ordinary traveler. She's the head of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and she has her own plans for justice. On an unusually mild morning in mid-June, the sun rose over Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, casting a golden glow on the tarmac as the day's first arrivals touched down. There was already a buzz of anticipation in the air. Families with children were scrambling to make the earliest flights. Business travelers in pressed suits strode through the corridors with laptops clutched in hand, and tourists snapped last-minute selfies before heading to the gates. Somewhere near the security lines, TSA agent Grant Fowler took a deep breath, mentally steeling himself for his shift. He had been with the Transportation Security Administration for 5 years, long enough to see his fair share of suspicious baggage, frustrated travelers, and tense encounters. Sporting a crisp uniform, he prided himself on a near-obsessive attention to detail. He always believed that if he dug deeper, probed more thoroughly, and trusted his instincts, he would make the airport safer. That morning, Grant was assigned to the high-volume checkpoint in the domestic terminal. The lines moved steadily, guided by the beeps of scanners and the watchful eyes of officers. Occasionally, an agent would call for a secondary inspection, or travelers would be asked to step aside. Even with all the formalities, Hartsfield-Jackson had a reputation for efficiency. Most people moved through at a decent pace, heading to their gates without too much hassle. At 7:00 a.m., the overhead announcements began listing the day's early flights. Passengers formed serpentine lines that snaked around stanchions. Grant watched them with a mixture of calm and vigilance. For him, everyone was a potential risk, no matter how they looked or behaved. A meltdown at security could mean trouble for thousands, let alone the potential for a genuine threat. And if a threat existed, he wanted to be the first to sniff it out. Little did he know that in just a few short hours, he would be at the center of a vortex of accusations, misunderstandings, and revelations that would leave him questioning all his deeply held assumptions. That day was about to become one of the most pivotal and damaging days of his career. Indeed, it would test the limits of his sense of justice, empathy, and professionalism, while shining a harsh spotlight on the fine line between vigilance and bias. Around 8:30 a.m., the crowds grew thicker. Families and business people jostled each other, focusing on their own urgent agendas. Grant's uniform clung uncomfortably to his back as the airport's central air conditioning struggled to counterbalance the Georgia heat and the crush of bodies. He kept his eyes peeled, scanning the crowd for unusual behavior. People avoiding eye contact, rummaging through pockets anxiously, or refusing to let their bags out of their grasp. Soon, he noticed a poised woman near the back of the line. She was tall, with elegantly braided hair pinned into a low chignon, dressed in a sharp navy blazer and matching pants. Her posture exuded calm confidence, almost too much calm in Grant's mind. He couldn't place why, but something about her self-assured aura made him suspicious. She had no fidgeting tics, no signs of stress like everyone else. She moved gracefully, her eyes scanning her surroundings as if she were assessing them. More curious still, there was no visible sign of hurry. Even though she had a flight to catch, presumably, she seemed perfectly at ease. Grant's gaze lingered on her. He almost lost track of what he was doing, checking IDs, verifying boarding passes, instructing people to remove shoes and laptops until she finally arrived at his station. Her name, according to her ID, was Harriet Brown. He noted the small grin on her face, almost like she knew something he didn't. Trying to make small talk and gauge her reactions, he asked, "Morning, Miss Brown. Traveling for business or pleasure today?" "Good morning, Agent," Harriet replied, her voice steady and polite. "Business, mostly. But I hope to enjoy myself as well." Grant nodded while letting his eyes flick toward the ID again. It was a valid Georgia driver's license, her birth date showing she was in her mid-40s. Though she didn't look a day over 35, she didn't offer more detail, which he found curious. "All right," he said. "Please take out any electronics and follow the line to the scanner." Harriet thanked him with a slight nod and continued ahead. She hadn't said anything out of line. Her presence hadn't disrupted any protocols. Still, an odd feeling tugged at Grant, like an itch in his mind he couldn't quite scratch. It wasn't simply the woman's calmness, he told himself. It was the seriousness in her eyes, the subdued authority in her voice. He decided to keep an eye on her as she proceeded through the checkpoint. The line advanced without incident, at least for a while, but Grant's unshakable intuition told him Harriet Brown was no ordinary passenger. He found himself glancing over at her belongings. She had one carry-on suitcase and a slim black backpack. Neither looked suspicious from the outside. Both sailed through the X-ray machine with no visible anomalies. Yet Grant's mind refused to quiet. People who wanted to conceal something usually acted fidgety, unless they were extremely well-trained or used to intense scrutiny. Harriet Brown radiated something akin to a quiet authority that had nothing to do with fear. As Harriet picked up her belongings from the conveyor belt, Grant felt a surge of adrenaline that whispered, "Don't let her slip away." He had no evidence, no cause, just a gut feeling that he should check deeper. But the line of passengers behind him was growing impatient. He hesitated, telling himself that if Harriet Brown truly warranted further inspection, the X-ray would have flagged something. Realistically, he had no reason to stop her. But that wouldn't be the end of it. Not by a long shot. Grant had a brief respite from the Harriet Brown situation as he navigated a small emergency with another traveler. A man in a wrinkled polo had forgotten to remove a large water bottle from his backpack, causing the X-ray machine to beep aggressively. The beloved passenger rolled his eyes when asked to remove it. By the time Grant resolved the issue, Harriet was already heading toward her gate. At least that's what he assumed. 15 minutes later, Grant spotted Harriet again, this time near a bustling coffee kiosk, calmly sipping a latte. He had stepped away from his station for a short break, partially to appease his throbbing tension headache and partially out of curiosity. Why was Harriet still in the terminal if her flight was soon? Her gate should have been in a different concourse entirely, but she seemed to be loitering. He watched as she scrolled through something on her phone, her face maintaining that same calm he had seen earlier. When Grant stepped closer, he caught a glimpse of what looked like security footage on her screen. Immediately, his heart rate spiked. Why would a random passenger have security footage on her phone? Was she surveilling the airport? The thought alarmed him. Harriet noticed him from the corner of her eye and locked her phone. She offered a polite smile, as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. Her phone was now face down on the small coffee table. Grant's mind raced with scenarios. Maybe she was a corporate security consultant or a local government official. Maybe she was a terrorist operative. The last possibility sent chills down his spine. Should he confront her now, off duty for the moment, or report her to a superior? He didn't want to appear paranoid. TSA management had warned agents numerous times about discriminatory profiling. Still, the unusual nature of Harriet's phone activity made him uneasy. Before he could decide what to do, Harriet finished her coffee, placed the empty cup neatly on the table, and walked away, disappearing into the bustling crowd. Grant couldn't let go of his growing suspicion. On one hand, nothing Harriet had done was explicitly incriminating. On the other hand, every part of his gut told him she was more than she seemed. The notion was almost an obsession. As he returned to his post, he resolved that if he saw Harriet Brown in the terminal again, he would request a secondary screening, or at least an official inquiry. He would not let her vanish from the airport without ensuring she wasn't carrying contraband or up to no good. He just needed a solid reason. A little after 10 a.m., Grant's shift led him to another section of the security checkpoint, where he assisted in random screenings. He found himself scanning the crowd with renewed intensity, searching for Harriet's distinct figure. The last thing he wanted was to let a potential threat roam free. He justified his concern by telling himself stories about cunning smugglers who had breezed through security by simply appearing confident and well-dressed. Just as he was about to give up hope of seeing Harriet again, there she was standing near a gate lounge, conversing with a uniformed pilot. The pilot nodded respectfully as they spoke. Harriet seemed comfortable, as if exchanging pleasantries with an old colleague. Then they shook hands, and the pilot hurried off. Harriet turned toward a window and gazed at the runway, her posture tall and relaxed. Grant's heart pounded. It wasn't necessarily suspicious to talk to a pilot, but the ease of their interaction, the pilot's respect, that was unusual. Or was he reading too much into ordinary politeness? He struggled to interpret the scene without bias. All he knew was that Harriet had a commanding presence that seemed out of place among everyday travelers. Unable to quell his curiosity, Grant approached Harriet. He was off to the side, near a row of chairs, before she noticed him. When Harriet did turn around, she gave him that same polite smile and nodded. "Hello again," Harriet said calmly, as if greeting an acquaintance at a corporate function. "Ma'am," Grant began, trying to keep his tone neutral, but failing to hide the tension in his voice. "I couldn't help but notice you're still here, a couple hours after going through security. Is everything all right with your flight?" Harriet tilted her head slightly, showing neither annoyance nor surprise. "Yes, Agent. My flight was delayed, and I've been catching up on some work. Is there something you'd like to ask me directly?" Grant felt a momentary flush of embarrassment. He didn't want to come off as harassing a passenger, but he also wasn't ready to let this go. "I, noticed you looking at something on your phone earlier. It looked like security footage. Could you clarify what that was about?" For a second, Harriet's face gave away nothing. Then she offered a gentle smile that revealed absolutely no fear. "That was a video feed from my office. I'm a federal employee, and I had to monitor a situation remotely." "Is that a problem, Agent Fowler?" She used his last name, which he hadn't given her. Immediately, Grant's instincts flared. "How do you know my name?" he asked, his voice edging toward defensive. Harriet simply gestured toward his TSA badge, which read Fowler. "It's right there," she answered smoothly. "I make it a point to respect the individuals who protect our airports." Grant exhaled in a surge of relief and frustration. Of course, she'd seen his badge. But for a moment, he'd felt like a fish on a hook. Harriet's calm presence seemed to unnerve him more than if she had been openly hostile. He tried to sound professional as he responded, "Right, of course, but I'd like to see your boarding pass and ID once more, please, just to confirm that everything is in order." Harriet handed them over without complaint. Everything seemed legitimate, confirming she was indeed Harriet Brown, scheduled on a Delta flight that had been delayed until 11:30 a.m. She had checked 0 baggage. Her personal items were all carry-ons. Nothing was amiss. "Thank you, Miss Brown," Grant said stiffly, returning her documents. "Is that all, Agent?" Harriet asked, a note of finality in her tone. Grant nodded. Yes, for now. She gave him one last polite smile and walked away. Grant stood there feeling both vindicated and foolish. He had found nothing tangible to validate his suspicions, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that Harriet Brown was more than she claimed. He told himself that perhaps he was overreacting. Maybe she was just a higher-up in some federal agency, traveling discreetly. That would explain the phone feed. But why would she be here in Atlanta, so calm and unhurried? He decided to let the matter rest for the moment, though the tension in his gut refused to dissipate. The day was far from over, and he had a troubling sense that events were about to escalate in a way he could never have imagined. As the morning inched toward noon, the terminal buzzed with the energy of impatient travelers. Flight delays were stacking up due to some weather disturbances along the East Coast. People paced the gate areas or hunched over their phones, waiting for updates. Grant returned to his assigned checkpoint, scanning IDs and reminding travelers to remove liquids. Halfway through, a middle-aged woman wearing a bright floral dress set off the metal detector, prompting a secondary inspection. Grant accompanied her to the pat-down area, stepping behind the portable barrier. That's when he heard a commotion erupt at the X-ray machine. An agitated voice resonated. "Stop that bag!" I said, "Stop that bag!" Grant finished the pat-down, quickly finding nothing. It turned out and hurried around the barrier to see what was going on. Another TSA agent, a rookie named Haley Ramirez, stood tense and uncertain, holding a small black backpack. Near her was Harriet Brown, arms folded, eyes narrowed. Grant's stomach flipped. "That's my backpack," Harriet said with impeccable calm. But the agent next to Haley, a taller man named Stephen Kane, was brandishing the bag as if it contained a live bomb. Kane pointed to the X-ray monitor, addressing Harriet harshly. "We have reason to believe you're carrying contraband, ma'am. Don't you dare touch the bag until we've had a chance to inspect it thoroughly." Harriet's eyebrows rose. "What contraband?" Kane didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned to Haley. "Take this bag to the side table. I'm going to have a look." His tone was unequivocally suspicious, and it drew the attention of every traveler in earshot. Phones started to come out. People were filming. Grant's pulse quickened. He recognized Harriet's bag from earlier. In his mind, he heard alarm bells. Could his suspicions have been correct? But Harriet Brown appeared more exasperated than fearful. She let out a measured breath. "Please check carefully. There should be nothing unusual inside." Kane unzipped the main compartment. He fished out a laptop, a tablet, some files, and a slim black folder. Then he rifled through the front pocket. After a moment, his hand emerged, holding two small plastic packets. They contained a white, powdery substance. Gasps erupted from onlookers, and Harriet's eyes darted to the packets. "What is that?" Harriet demanded, her tone still composed, but tinged with sternness. Kane waved them in front of her face. "Care to explain?" Grant's heart hammered in his chest. He had witnessed travelers get caught carrying innocuous powder that turned out to be baby formula, protein mix, or prescription foot powder. But the way Kane held those packets was loaded with accusation, like he'd already convicted Harriet. The crowd pressed in, forming a ring of wide-eyed spectators. In a voice that brooked no nonsense, Harriet said, "That's foot powder and medication I need for a chronic condition. Both are in properly labeled packages. Check them. You should find a prescription label on one and an over-the-counter label on the other." Kane's eyes narrowed. "Or it could be cocaine, or heroin, or God knows what else. We'll just have to run some tests." Harriet stared him down, her jaw set. "Do what you must." Grant sensed trouble brewing. This was a precarious situation. The slightest misstep could ignite a larger confrontation. And Harriet, from all her composure, seemed like someone who wouldn't take kindly to false accusations. Fearing Kane would escalate the situation, Grant stepped closer and tapped him on the shoulder. Let's test the substance, Grant suggested carefully. No need to make a scene. Could be legitimate. Kane shot Grant a look of annoyance. I know what I'm doing, he hissed. People always try to pass off their contraband as something harmless. Grant tensed. Kane was a senior agent, but his approach was far from professional right now. Harriet, on the other hand, remained outwardly calm, though a slight tension in her posture betrayed her anger. She said nothing, letting the procedure play out. Haley brought over a narcotics test kit. Kane carefully extracted a trace of the powder and placed it into the reagent compartment. Everyone watched as the chemical process took place. Several excruciating moments passed while Kane shook the tester tube. Eventually, the solution remained clear, showing no color change that would indicate illegal drugs. Kane frowned. Let's test the other packet. He repeated the process with the same result, clear, no trace of illicit substances. A wave of relief, mingled with embarrassment, swept through the gathering of TSA agents. The onlookers whispered among themselves, phones still rolling. Harriet's expression hardened. Are you satisfied now? She asked Kane, a note of authority edging into her voice. Kane hesitated, clearly unwilling to stand down so easily. He eyed Harriet with a look that implied he suspected she'd just outsmarted the test. I still think it's suspicious that you carry these substances in your bag without making it known. Harriet's voice grew cooler. Foot powder is not contraband, agent, nor are prescription medications. I have every right to carry them. Sensing things could spiral further, Grant intervened, trying to maintain a facade of calm authority. Miss Brown, please accept our apologies. Sometimes these screenings reveal questionable items, and we have to ensure passenger safety. If you'll be patient a moment longer, we'll finalize our checks. He turned to Kane and asked, Is there anything else in the bag? Kane shook his head grimly, as if disappointed he hadn't found a bigger catch. Grant nodded, then looked to Harriet. You're free to collect your belongings, ma'am. Harriet picked up the bag and reassembled her items. She paused, letting her gaze sweep over the ring of TSA agents and curious travelers. For a fleeting moment, Grant caught a glimpse of icy resentment in her eyes, but she masked it quickly. Before turning to leave, Harriet said, I hope this concludes the matter. With that, she walked away, leaving Kane glowering, Haley gawking, and Grant feeling a hollow sense of guilt. Had they just profiled a passenger, potentially a high-level federal employee, based on intangible suspicions? The seeds of doubt and fear that had been planted in Grant's mind earlier now sprouted into a far more ominous tangle. He couldn't even guess how Harriet Brown might respond to this humiliating incident, but something told him they hadn't seen the last of her. The afternoon air in the terminal felt thick with tension long after Harriet Brown disappeared from sight. Word of the incident spread quickly among TSA staff. Some speculated Harriet was a cunning smuggler who'd found a way to fool the test kits. Others ridiculed Kane's overzealousness. The truth was that nobody had any definitive answers, only swirling rumors. Grant tried to focus on his duties, but he kept replaying Harriet's stoic expression in his mind, along with the sense that there was more to her story. Why would a random traveler remain so composed under false accusations? Why had she seemed so at home in the airport, conversing with a pilot and reviewing what looked like security footage? By 2:00 p.m., Grant was summoned to the supervisory office. Nerves churned in his gut as he walked in, half expecting a reprimand for how the incident had escalated. To his surprise, his supervisor, Karen Layton, didn't look angry, she looked worried. Close the door, Layton said, beckoning Grant to sit. She took a seat behind her desk, flipping through some documents. We have a situation. Word came from higher up that Harriet Brown, the passenger at the center of this fiasco, is no ordinary traveler. She's Harriet L. Brown, newly appointed head of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. She reports directly to the commissioner of CBP. Essentially, she's a very big deal. Grant's face went pale, his throat constricted as though he'd swallowed a rock. The head of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. That position held immense influence over airport security policies, interagency operations, and more. The synergy between TSA and CBP was critical. If Harriet Brown was indeed that high-ranking an official, they were in deep trouble. Leighton sighed, massaging her temples. Apparently, Miss Brown was in Atlanta for a series of confidential meetings. She was traveling incognito, hoping to observe standard security protocols firsthand. And now, thanks to that fiasco at the checkpoint, we may be facing a formal complaint for unlawful profiling or harassment. She's well within her rights to raise an official stink. Grant felt a buzzing in his ears. He remembered Harriet's calm, unwavering composure. Now it made sense. She was used to command, used to dealing with tense situations at the highest levels. He also recalled how Kane had waved those packets in her face in front of a crowd, as though sure she was a criminal. Guilt and fear battled in his chest. "What's going to happen?" he managed to ask. Leighton shrugged, clearly at a loss. "We don't know yet. Miss Brown has apparently left the airport for now. Word is she might be returning this evening, but not for a flight. Possibly to meet with TSA leadership. If that happens, I expect heads will roll. We need to handle this carefully." A heaviness settled in the room. Grant understood that Harriet Brown, as head of CBP, held enough sway to demand serious consequences for any TSA agent who violated protocol or engaged in discriminatory behavior. If she wanted to make an example out of Kane or the entire Atlanta TSA workforce, she had the clout to do it. Leighton's expression softened slightly. "Grant, I know you've had your suspicions about Miss Brown since this morning, but we have to be very careful. If it looks like you profiled her, especially on grounds of race, it could cost you your job and tarnish the agency's reputation. And I'm sure you're aware that racial profiling complaints can lead to lawsuits." Grant nodded numbly. The possibility that Harriet Brown might interpret the entire chain of events as racially motivated was a terrifying prospect. But was it racial profiling or just overzealous suspicion? He tried to rationalize, recalling the subtle triggers that fueled his watchfulness. Harriet's calm demeanor, her conversation with the pilot, the security footage on her phone. He told himself it had nothing to do with her being black, but would Harriet or anyone else believe that? Leighton let out a long breath. "You should be prepared to answer questions. Stick to the facts. Don't try to defend Kane's approach. The video footage alone shows him going overboard. We'll see how Miss Brown wishes to proceed." Grant left the office feeling rattled. The entire day had spiraled out of control, and the worst part was that he could hardly separate his gut suspicion from the truth. Yes, Harriet Brown had turned out to be a big player in the federal system, but that alone didn't prove he'd been correct to single her out. Now he was left to wonder whether he'd inadvertently let bias color his judgment. Hours later, as the sun dipped behind the airport terminals, a tense hush fell over one of the executive lounges typically reserved for high-ranking officials and VIP guests. Normally, this lounge was used by airline CEOs, visiting dignitaries, or top brass from agencies like TSA and CBP when they needed a discreet space for meetings. Grant Fowler found himself there, flanked by Supervisor Karen Leighton, TSA Officer Haley Ramirez, and a few other staff members involved in the day's incident. They had been summoned to meet Harriet Brown, who had reportedly returned to the airport for a debrief with TSA leadership. Nerves sizzled in the air. Just after 6:00 p.m., the door opened to reveal Harriet Brown. She entered with measured steps, her posture impeccable. Gone was her discreet travelling attire. She now wore a distinguished suit with a CBP pin on the lapel, her braided hair styled in a neat updo. A hush fell over the room. In this setting, her authority was undeniable. Behind Harriet trailed a couple of aides and a CBP legal representative. For a moment, Harriet let her gaze sweep across the anxious faces. Finally she spoke, her voice calm but imbued with a quiet intensity. "Good evening. Thank you for meeting on such short notice. I'm here to address the events that transpired earlier today involving me and certain TSA agents at this airport." Leighton stepped forward. "Miss Brown, Madam Director, I want to extend our sincerest apologies. The incident you experienced at our checkpoint was unfortunate, and we take such matters seriously. We hope to clarify any misunderstandings and ensure that such an event does not happen again." Harriet acknowledged Leighton's words with a slight nod. "I appreciate that, Miss Leighton. However, I need to understand precisely what happened and why it happened. We can't gloss over the possibility that protocol was violated or that bias may have played a role." The mention of bias caused a ripple of unease. A few agents exchanged glances, but Harriet remained poised, eyes unwavering. Leighton motioned for everyone to sit around a large conference table. Harriet took the seat at the head. Once everyone settled, Harriet turned to Grant, her expression unreadable. "Agent Fowler," she began, "I recognize you from this morning. You were the first to check my ID, correct?" Grant nodded, feeling sweat trickle along his spine. "Yes, ma'am. I verified your ID and boarding pass. I also believe I saw you again around the coffee kiosk and later at the gate," Harriet continued. "You seemed concerned about my presence in the terminal. Could you share with us why you found me suspicious?" It felt like an interrogation, but Harriet's tone wasn't accusatory, it was probing. Grant swallowed hard. Well, it was a combination of factors. I saw you looking at what appeared to be security footage on your phone, and I noticed you conversing with a pilot in a manner that suggested a prior acquaintance. You seemed very calm, which was unusual given the crowds and delays. I didn't know who you were at the time, so I was just trying to be vigilant." Harriet listened without interruption. "Did you suspect I was carrying contraband, or did your suspicions stem purely from my demeanor?" Grant struggled to keep his voice steady. "I had no concrete reason to believe you were carrying anything illegal. My concern was more about potential security risks. You seemed well informed about airport operations, and that made me wonder if you could be a threat." A subtle flicker of disappointment crossed Harriet's face. "I see. And was my race a factor in your suspicion?" Grant felt a chill. He'd dreaded this question all day. "No, ma'am. At least, not consciously. I never intended to single you out based on race." Harriet studied him carefully, as though measuring the sincerity of his words. Then she turned to Kane, who was seated uneasily across the table. "Agent Kane, could you explain your actions when you found the powder packets in my backpack?" Kane's cheeks reddened, and he cleared his throat. "I saw the white powder on the X-ray image. Protocol states that any suspicious powder should be examined. That's what I did." One of Harriet's aides spoke up. "But you accused Miss Brown of smuggling illegal drugs and displayed the substance to bystanders in direct violation of standard courtesy. Why did you jump to that conclusion before testing it?" Kane fumbled for words. "It's standard procedure to treat unknown powders as potential narcotics. I was simply being cautious." Harriet's gaze hardened. "Cautious is one thing, Agent. Publicly humiliating a traveler by waving personal property in the air before verifying it is quite another. Do you see how this might be perceived as profiling? And not only racial profiling. Any passenger, regardless of race, deserves more respect than that." A heavy silence draped the room. Harriet's words were pointed but calm, reflecting the seriousness of the issue. Leighton shifted in her seat, clearing her throat. "Miss Brown, we're prepared to launch an internal review of the incident and offer any restitution you feel is appropriate. Harriet clasped her hands in front of her. I appreciate that, Miss Layton, but my concern goes beyond personal restitution. Incidents like this suggest systemic issues, lack of training, possible bias, or simply a culture that encourages suspicion without proper checks. I want to see changes implemented, training improved, and accountability enforced. Grant found himself oddly relieved. Harriet wasn't out for blood, she wanted structural change. She could have demanded they fire Kane and penalize him. Instead, she was focusing on broader improvements. A small voice in the back of Grant's mind admired her commitment. At the same time, Harriet had not yet said she wouldn't press charges or file a formal complaint. Her next words clarified that, I'm not looking to ruin careers today, Harriet said evenly, but I do expect a thorough internal review. I will be filing an official report with the TSA's Office of Inspection and with the Department of Homeland Security's Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Office. I believe we can use this case as a teaching moment rather than a purely punitive one. Kane looked visibly deflated, though he seemed relieved that Harriet wasn't demanding an immediate termination. For his part, Grant exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Maybe this wouldn't destroy his life, after all. After the meeting, Harriet and her entourage left to speak privately with higher TSA leadership, leaving the agents in a state of subdued shock. Grant hovered by the coffee machine outside the lounge, processing the discussion. His heart still pounded from the intensity of being directly questioned by the head of CBP. Haley Ramirez approached him, her expression guarded. You okay? She asked softly, pouring herself a cup of stale lounge coffee. Grant shrugged. I don't know. That could have been a lot worse, but it was still intense. Haley glanced around, as if fearful someone might overhear. I feel bad about the whole thing. Kane roped me into helping him search her bag. I should have insisted on testing it immediately, instead of letting him brandish it in front of everyone. Grant sighed. Don't beat yourself up. We all could have handled it better. It's a mess, but at least it seems Miss Brown wants to address it systemically, not just punish everyone involved. Haley nodded, looking somewhat reassured. Then she lowered her voice. I overheard she's giving a press statement tomorrow, but it's more about general airport security improvements. I think the agency wants to keep the specifics about this incident under wraps. Grant stared at the floor. That meant the story might not blow up in the national news, another small relief. But the possibility of a formal internal review still weighed heavily on him. He'd be asked to detail every moment of his interactions with Harriet Brown, from the first time he spotted her until the final confrontation. And any whiff of racial bias could have serious consequences, not just for him, but for the entire Atlanta TSA. Feeling the exhaustion of the day, he decided to go home. He clocked out and left the airport in a daze, weaving through the departing passengers. But as soon as he stepped into the warm Atlanta evening, he realized the day's events had left a deeper scar than he cared to admit. Meanwhile, Harriet Brown sat in a discreetly arranged CBP vehicle, heading to a hotel near the airport. She stared at the skyline receding behind them. Her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues and superiors, but for a moment she ignored them. She closed her eyes, letting the day's tension settle. The entire situation had been frustrating. Harriet had hoped her incognito trip through the airport would allow her to see how TSA agents treated ordinary travelers. She wanted to identify genuine logistical issues, test the efficacy of the scanning equipment, and observe passenger flow. She never anticipated being singled out and publicly shamed. The experience rattled her more than she cared to admit, but Harriet was no stranger to confrontation or adversity. As a black woman who rose to a high-ranking federal position, she'd faced countless obstacles and overcame them. This incident was yet another reminder that bias could rear its head in the very institutions sworn to protect and serve. Harriet was determined to use her influence to drive meaningful change. She also couldn't ignore the pang of personal disappointment. It had stung to see how quickly an agent like Kane leapt to the conclusion that she was smuggling drugs. She thought about the countless other innocent travelers, especially people of color who might endure similar humiliations. Her anger flared, but she tamped it down. Reacting with fury wouldn't solve the larger issues. With a heavy sigh, Harriet reached for her phone and responded to urgent texts from CBP's legal counsel. She'd scheduled a press conference to highlight a new collaboration initiative between TSA and CBP, focusing on improved technology and training to reduce false suspicions and speed up screening times. She planned to reference her personal experience in broad terms, emphasizing the need for reform without calling out specific agents by name. Nonetheless, Harriet intended to ensure an investigation took place and that real changes followed. Looking out the window at the twinkling city lights, Harriet felt both exhausted and resolute. She might have been misjudged as a smuggler today, but tomorrow she'd stand at a podium and reaffirm her commitment to fairness, efficiency, and security. One misstep from a few agents wouldn't tear down her belief that the majority of TSA workers aimed to do their job responsibly. Still, she knew it would take more than good intentions to dismantle a system where bias could exist in the shadows. While Harriet rested, Grant spent a sleepless night wrestling with guilt and anxiety. He replayed the chain of events in his head, questioning whether he'd been driven by unconscious bias. The next morning, his alarm blared at 5:00 a.m. He got up, barely functioning on a few hours of restless sleep, and prepared for another day at the airport. When he arrived, he found a subdued atmosphere among the TSA staff. Many had heard about Harriet Brown's presence and the tense meeting. There was a rumor that Miss Brown would be addressing staff via a video conference later in the week. Morale was at an all-time low, as people worried about repercussions. To Grant's surprise, he was called into Leighton's office again, first thing in the morning. Kane was already there, looking furious. Leighton sat behind her desk, expression grim. "We've received some immediate directives from TSA headquarters," Leighton announced. "In response to what happened with Miss Brown, the agency wants to set an example. There will be a suspension for Agent Kane, pending further investigation." Kane jumped up, his voice shaking. "A suspension? Are you kidding me? I was following procedure. This is ridiculous." Leighton spread her hands in a placating gesture. "Whether or not you intended it, your behavior escalated a situation unnecessarily and put the agency in a terrible position. We have statements from multiple witnesses that you treated Miss Brown in a manner inconsistent with standard protocol." Kane's face turned red. "So I'm the sacrificial lamb?" Leighton frowned, her eyes flicking to Grant. "At this time, Agent Fowler, you're not facing suspension. However, you will be subjected to a formal review. You'll have to meet with the Office of Inspection and potentially the Civil Rights Division. Don't make any public comments or talk to the press." Grant's stomach churned. He felt horrible for Kane, even if Kane had indeed crossed the line. The man had a family, mortgage payments, and years in the agency. Now he risked losing it all. But Kane's scowl suggested he blamed everyone else for his downfall. Grant wondered if Kane would point fingers at him during the review. As Kane stormed out of the office, Grant caught Leighton's eye. "I never wanted this to happen," he murmured. Leighton sighed. "I know, but the wheels are in motion. Just comply with the review. If you acted without malice, they'll see that." Grant nodded numbly. Karma, it seemed, had landed a heavy blow, especially on Kane. A swirl of conflicting emotions gripped Grant: relief that he wasn't suspended, guilt for Kane's predicament, and dread over the impending review. And above all, the grim knowledge that Harriet Brown, through her position, was making sure accountability was enforced. Over the next few days, Harriet Brown's press conference took place at a government building near the airport, drawing moderate media attention. She addressed the need for improved cooperation between TSA and CBP, mentioning how travelers sometimes felt intimidated or humiliated during security checks. She cited her own recent experience, though not in detail, as a catalyst for re-evaluating certain protocols. Back at the airport, the TSA staff found themselves under new scrutiny. Journalists lingered in the halls, hoping to interview passengers about their treatment. Tensions ran high. Some agents resented Harriet Brown for overreacting, while others believed she'd done the right thing by shining a light on possible profiling. Grant mostly kept his head down, complying with the ongoing internal review. As part of the review, an investigator from the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties interviewed Grant. The session was nerve-wracking. He recounted his every action, from that first moment he'd noticed Harriet in line to the final confrontation. He was asked point-blank if Harriet's race had influenced his decision-making. He insisted it hadn't, but the investigator's poker face revealed nothing. In the days following, Harriet herself occasionally passed through the airport on official business. Each time Grant caught sight of her, his stomach clenched. She never so much as glanced his way. But rumors circulated that Harriet was actively reviewing the airport's training modules with TSA leadership, pushing for more rigorous instruction on unconscious bias, protocol clarity, and respectful passenger interaction. In a curious twist, Harriet's stance on not publicly naming or shaming specific agents seemed to earn her some respect among staff. She aimed to build a collaborative path forward rather than exact vengeance. Still, Kane faced the brunt of disciplinary measures for his flagrant mishandling of the situation, and the message was clear: no one was above accountability. For Grant, life took an unexpected turn. A few weeks after the incident, he received news that Harriet Brown had formally recommended him for specialized training in interagency collaboration, part of her new initiative. Her reasoning: he had demonstrated vigilance, albeit clouded by some missteps, and she believed he could become a better agent with the right mentorship. He was flawed. Harriet had singled him out not for punishment, but for potential growth. It felt like a form of redemption, or at least a second chance to prove he wasn't a bigot. Acceptance letters and instructions arrived soon after. The training would be held in Washington, D.C., co-hosted by high-level TSA and CBP officials. Grant felt a complicated mix of gratitude, apprehension, and lingering shame. He still recalled the moment Harriet turned that icy glare on him when she was accused of smuggling contraband. Now, ironically, she was offering him an opportunity to reform himself and the system. Grant flew to Washington, D.C. to attend the specialized training. The sessions focused on bridging the gap between TSA and CBP operations, exploring advanced screening technology, legal frameworks, and especially the role of unconscious bias in security work. Harriet Brown oversaw parts of the program, giving opening remarks and participating in panel discussions. On the final day, the participants were invited to a roundtable Q&A. Harriet was there, flanked by other senior officials. They opened the floor to questions. Nervous, Grant raised his hand. When Harriet called on him, he stood up, voice trembling with both respect and lingering regret. "Thank you, Director Brown," he began, "for providing this training opportunity. I, wanted to publicly acknowledge that my vigilance back in Atlanta may have been tainted by unconscious bias. I'm learning how subtle those influences can be. I wanted to ask, what advice would you give agents like me who genuinely want to protect the public but risk letting our judgments be clouded by preconceptions? For a moment, Harriet's dark eyes pinned him. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then she offered a measured smile, her voice projecting both empathy and authority. First, be aware of your own instincts. Vigilance is crucial, but instincts can be shaped by cultural and personal biases. Challenge yourself to see each passenger as an individual, not a stereotype or a statistic. Second, follow protocol meticulously. That structure helps remove personal bias from the equation. And finally, be open to accountability. If you make a mistake, own it and learn from it. Only then can we build an airport security culture that is both safe and fair. Grant felt relief wash over him, as if Harriet had offered a kind of absolution. The round table ended on a high note, with multiple staff members asking thoughtful questions. Harriet took time to speak to them individually afterward, though the conversation was mostly professional. Grant mustered the courage to approach her, quietly thanking her for giving him a second chance. Harriet simply nodded, telling him that genuine change comes from within and that she hoped he'd continue to grow in his role. When Grant returned to Hartsfield-Jackson a few days later, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was determined to use his training to treat every passenger with fairness and dignity. He joined the newly formed Bias Awareness Task Force, a group that Harriet had recommended be established at major airports. They held monthly meetings, discussing scenarios and best practices for handling high-tension situations. Kane, in the meantime, received notice that his suspension had been turned into a demotion. He was reassigned to a smaller regional airport. While he felt bitter about the outcome, he had little recourse. Harriet Brown's stance on accountability had hardened after reviewing the final investigative reports. It was a harsh lesson that actions and how they're perceived can have life-altering consequences. As weeks turned into months, Harriet occasionally visited Atlanta for briefings. Word traveled that the new training protocols were already reducing complaints of harassment and speeding up screening lines. Grant saw Harriet from a distance now and then, and though they never had another personal conversation, he felt a certain gratitude. She had been wronged, yet she chose to reform the system instead of merely punishing the individuals involved. For Harriet, the changes in TSA were just one part of her broader mission. She championed legislative efforts to secure funding for better security tech, advocated for stronger inter-agency data sharing, and insisted on more robust oversight. She had no illusions that one humiliating encounter could fix everything overnight. But she believed in incremental progress, each step closer to a future where travelers of all backgrounds could expect dignity and competence from airport security staff. Though Harriet had endured that day's humiliation, in the end, her response shaped a legacy of reform. And for Grant Fowler, the experience was seared into his memory as the day his life changed forever, for the better, ultimately. He learned the fine line between vigilance and prejudice, and that every passenger deserved respect. In Harriet Brown, he had found not an adversary, but a mentor, one whose example of calm strength and principled leadership he would carry with him for the rest of his career. Thank you for joining us on this roller coaster journey of misjudgment, power, and redemption. From the tense moments of suspicion in the bustling security lines to the powerful revelations behind closed doors, we've witnessed how one dramatic encounter sparked long overdue changes within a critical federal agency. Prejudice and suspicion nearly ruined careers, yet ultimately paved the way for personal growth, new policies, and a renewed commitment to fairness in airport security. If this story moved you, sparked your curiosity, or made you reflect on how we perceive others, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more compelling stories to light, true or fictional, that challenge our assumptions and remind us that every person deserves respect. Stay tuned for our next video, and thank you for watching.